he had made the statement that he didn't own a gun, but we kept finding a lot of .22 ammunition in his residence. We talked to the landlord, and he said, I had a .22 caliber pistol. I bought it from Mr. Salinas. The last time I saw it was in Mr. Salinas's room.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, The Murder of Aubrey Nuckolls, Part 3 of 4. And the marijuana, possibly, right?
Well, that's the money. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the value. That's the money. He had to get that. And another, well, I'll get into this a little later. Another thing that I just wanted, they don't make it easy for you, but their greed or their animus makes them overlook mistakes. The money, what he could get for that marijuana, he's pushing for this $20,000 ransom. He can't just go, well, I've killed a guy, let's get away with it. You know, he's got to make that extra little push, and that was his mistake.
And I think that was the point that we were up over the top of the hill. We'd reached the summit and we're going down.
Yeah, from there
very
on.
Quickly, we had a gentleman that, it was a guy that I knew that contacted us. I got to talking to him. He came down and gave an interview, and it was a guy I knew from the streets, I guess, best I remember. And he said, this guy was, I guess, kind of your average guy, but he was an alcoholic.
Oh, you're talking about, well, the way we got a hold of him, the landlord of the suspect, when we found out who he was, we went there and found out he lived in a home. The landlord lived in the back of the house. The front of the house was kind of like mutual property. And the upstairs was where the suspect lived. And the suspect lived there for, I guess the fee he paid was helping redo the house. So they were remodeling this whole home with the owner and his wife living in the back, the suspect living upstairs, and kind of a front 2-room joint communal area.
Now, the guy I was referring to, he was a guy that worked for the landlord.
Yeah.
And he had a drinking problem. He did little odd jobs and things, and he was just a guy that was in a rough spot in life. He pretty much would sit up and drink all night and look to make $1 here and there. I think by most standards, he was a pretty decent guy. But I think he saw either in the newspaper or on the news, he saw the coverage of this and had a oh crap moment. And he made contact with us. And I initially, when I called him, like I said, I'd had dealings with him before, and he was afraid that he was going to get implicated in a homicide. So he wanted to cooperate 100%. So he either came to headquarters or I went and picked him up. I think you and I interviewed him. And he said that our suspect, you know, he'd kind of befriended him and had done some odd and end kind of work for him. He said that the suspect was kind of an artistic guy in a sense and always had projects going on and things like that. He said, well, the suspect contacted him and says, hey, I need your help. So I think he was going to pay him $20 to help him move a heavy object that needed to be put into his vehicle. So, of course, with him being intoxicated probably 24 hours a day, more or less, he didn't think much of it. He saw a $20 bill. So he agreed to it, and the suspect picked him up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, took him over to the house where we later found that the homicide actually occurred. They went into the house, that upstairs room, I think that Paul was talking about, or downstairs was talking about in that common area. The room was unlit, and there was this thing
And where was this house?
Dewey Street in Lexington near downtown.
Gotcha. Just make sure we got an idea. How, and again, timeline wise, what are we talking about from time of report to your getting this information?
Month.
Okay, so for our listeners, let's kind of give a chronological timeline from when the wife made contact regarding this ransom note. Bring us up to where we are with the timeline of how this transpired.
The police were contacted on the 11th of September. Fairly quickly, we gathered the information from the victim's wife. A lot of that information obviously had to do with the evidence that was collected was that letter and so forth. And I think we got some other mail matter and some information from the wife about some of his associates and so forth. So already calls were being made and people were being located and so forth. We couldn't account for the vehicle, the family vehicle. So typically what we do is a police department's put out what's called an ATL, an attempt to locate, trying to find that vehicle. And of course, it wasn't found for almost a month until we located the victim in it. But very quickly, I think they got into the storage unit. I think the information garnered from his wife, that was a pretty easy part. And of course, like Detective Williams said a little while ago, that really stood out. So we got on that quickly, and our narcotics people went over, and that was kind of, I guess you'd call it sort of a bombshell when you find 12 pounds of high-grade marijuana. So that kind of turned us in a certain direction on this investigation. That happened pretty much the next day. After that, we learned that it turns out the suspect went to the storage unit trying to collect property that basically belonged to the victim that he really didn't have a right to. And then again, you factor in that the wife had said that there was only 2 keys to the unit. One was in her possession and one was in her estranged husband's possession. So
by the time that this happened, we actually had possession of her key. She gave it to us and we held on to it for a while.
Right.
So it was us and him was the only one that could access it.
right.
The whole break in the case comes from the guy who was running the unit, who was a good enough citizen to go, hey, the police are here. This guy's in. There's something wrong. Let me get a hold of him. But he had the wherewithal to get that car description and that virtually a complete license number. Boy, you just don't get breaks like that. That's where you're just, tickled to death. The other thing, that doesn't make the case. That gives us a suspect. And we can really concentrate our investigations there. Going to take a whole lot more to make the case, but half of any case is identifying your suspect first. Then the rest of the second half is putting enough case together to get past probable cause, make the arrest, and actually push for beyond a reasonable doubt.
And we've said it before, and even current day with all the things that are going on in our own city with all these shootings and things, and people question the ability of the police to solve these cases. The police don't solve these cases. The community does. In this instance, the gentleman from the storage facility came with a critical piece of information. Then later we get another critical piece of information from the gentleman that ultimately helped him unknowingly move the victim's body. So, things like that are what actually solve this case. I think we're pretty intelligent people. Most of us are pretty savvy, especially after we've gotten experience on the streets and things. But the reality to this is, in any of these cases, it's the community more so than our own smarts that solve these cases. And we're just there to put the pieces together
and assemble it for presentation.
That's right. We're the protectors of the evidence. And
there's a couple of cases that I know right now. I know who did them. We just never were able to get enough evidence to push it over the top for the prosecutor to say, yeah, we're going to go with it. With only them having one shot at prosecution, they're not going to waste it on a faulty case. So, I've got several cases. Luckily, between Schoonover and Rob Wilson, I found out that 3 of my cold cases have been solved since I've been gone. And those were cases that pretty well knew who did them, couldn't prove it. And they got down and hammered out. And got
especially with DNA.
Yeah.
The technology in DNA and the processes and things, and the ability to take just a minute sample and either replicate that sample to make, a big enough source to test from, or just the process in of itself has changed so much that, a lot of these cold cases are solved years later. But it just reinforces that what we did back then before technology changed, we were doing very solid police work. We just didn't have the right person come forth in the community to give us that solid link to do just what Detective Williams was talking about and take it and present it in a court setting, because we didn't want to risk failure and not being able to go back and charge that person again.
So you're able to locate this suspect or potential suspect regarding it's who is showing up on the license plate. And that leads you to this home on Deweese you were speaking of, right?
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what happens when you learn of Deweese.
It's everything in this case is strange people. We run into that address, and it's a single family dwelling that is under renovation. Yeah. And the gentleman who owns the property is very familiar with the suspect. The suspect lives in an upstairs loft apartment, and the suspect lives there essentially free for work. And what they're doing between the owner and the suspect is they're just completely refurbishing the house. And the upstairs has been refurbished, looking very well. This is probably a century-old home, what used to be we called a shotgun home, very narrow, long. The term comes from the fact that you could stand in the front of the house, shoot a shotgun, and hit everybody in the house for the entire length of the house because it's a narrow little house. And they had done a lot of work, and it was looked quite good. But he lived in the back primarily with his girlfriend, and you had this little community area in the front, and then you went upstairs to the loft, which was where the suspect resided.
So you all went there and discovered the home and
talked to the suspect wasn't there, talked to the owner, found out who lived upstairs, got background information on both of them, found out that he wasn't home. He owned rental property. So he was out working on his rental property. The suspect oftentimes had friends that would come by and visit, and they concentrated in those first two rooms. One of them was a storage room, which had just a ton of craft stuff, like
art type stuff.
Yeah. And this was one of the things that Salinas did for money. He would make Mexican pottery and sold. He had a lot of things he made with plaster Paris and things along those lines. This is what was stored primarily in that room with his computer in this other downstairs room.
So at some point, finally, we do get a search warrant.
Yes.
That was a key turning point. As with any case, we have to be able to lawfully go in and search an area. And with this being basically a residence of the suspect, even though we had the owner there, there's an expectation of privacy for this person who is basically, whether it be for money or for trade of work or whatever you want to call it, he had an expectation of privacy because that was his home. So I think, Paul, you did the search warrant, if I recall. Once the search warrant was executed, here comes some other connections because we found some ammunition.
He had made
a weapon.
He had made the statement that he didn't own a gun, but we kept finding a lot of .22 ammunition in his residence. We talked to the landlord, and he said, I had a .22 caliber pistol. I bought it from Mr. Salinas. The last time I saw it was in Mr. Salinas's room. He had it up there. And that gun did not turn up anywhere on that search warrant. We did find the ammo, and the most telling thing was something in the floor of that storage room where his computer was and all of his merchandise was. There was a lot of paint splattered around, but one little patch in particular, and this just comes from seeing it a lot. I was convinced was dried blood. And we collected that, and it turned out to be human blood. The victim was so decomposed when we got him, we couldn't get a good, back in it was the early days of DNA, we couldn't get a good DNA profile on him. We had to find some kinfolk to him. I think a daughter from a first marriage.
It was a daughter.
To get a good profile of him, and then we were able to match it to the blood we found in that room. And so obviously he had bled in that room. So that was a huge clue that we found the murder scene.
So you've talked to Mr. Salinas at this point. You've made contact with him, and he's not going to talk to us. He doesn't deny anything.
He lawyered up, so to speak.
He's just, I'm not talking to you. Do what you're going to do. So at that point, we didn't have enough to connect him to the homicide. We'd received information that he was planning on going back to Mexico. So we figured if we got there, we'd never get him again. So we started examining the elements of the kidnap case and what we could do to, we could definitely say that we can put him in possession of the guy's car. We can put him in possession of the guy's keys. We can put him in contact with him. So at that point, we charge him.
And then we had the witness who helped move something very heavy.
Yeah.
Who got something wet that was red on his leg that Mr. Salinas told him, said, it's paint. This is something I made for a customer, and it was made with lead. It's heavy. Helped me load it. So when this witness realized that this was on his leg, Salinas quickly wiped it away. Says it's paint, throws away the rag or paper towel or whatever he used. They load what turns out to be the body in the back of this car. So where this witness was important, this witness, either through the newspaper or through television, saw coverage of this. And even though he was a guy who drank a lot, all of a sudden it popped in his head that, holy cow, I think I'll help load a body. So he wanted to talk very quickly because, again, he didn't want to be implicated in the actual murder of this victim. So he was very forthcoming with information when he talked to us. Like I said, he turned over a key piece of evidence that turned out to be
the victim's
blood, which was on the tongue of one of his shoes. So
now, he contacted us after Salinas was locked up. After we charged him with the kidnapping, the press got a hold of it. Well, actually, the FBI released it. And that press coverage of the kidnapping and everything else, at that time, we hadn't found the body at that time.
Yeah, we had not located the body.
So they ended up putting that story out, and this was the press that got the witness's attention is, oh my goodness, that started to connect with me. But there comes a time when you keep information from the public because you want the advantage of moving around without people knowing what you're doing, and the advantage of being able to talk to people before they're necessarily aware that you're looking at them is a valuable technique.
Case integrity. You have to keep that close.
So you try not to.
Had the witness told you all where he had moved this body?
Yes, when the witness came for us and told us, we had no idea where the actual homicide scene was. We knew the body had been stored there and moved from there, so the investigation proceeded to that location to try to determine if that was the murder scene, and it turned out to be the murder scene.
But the witness wasn't there when the murder
No, the witness was there to help move.
So where does he tell you that the body was taken?
He didn't know.
Well, he didn't know
where the body
last saw it
ended
put
up.
in the trunk.
Under the pretense that it's art.
Yeah. He got his $20 and he went home. He was happy. Yeah. He made $20
in the suspect's vehicle. He was adamant that the car he loaded it into was a blue Chevy Impala that he knew to be the suspect's from knowing the suspect previously was parked out in front of the suspect's home. We found the body in a red Pontiac 88.
Bonneville, maybe?
Bonneville. Yeah, it was a red Bonneville, which belonged to the victim.
So how did you find the car?
Well, when this hit the press, another witness came forward. This lady had lived in Jessamine County, a county away, and she was familiar with the suspect. he had been introduced to her by another friend on occasion, had done some yard work and stuff for her, and had known him for about 4 years, and she occasionally let him house sit when she was gone. He approaches her and says, I have a vehicle I'm going to buy. Said vehicle is in the process of being repossessed. Until the fellow I'm buying it from gets the repossession taken care of, I need a place to stash it. I want to hide it, and then when he gets it paid off, I'll complete the transaction with him, and I'll have a car. And the lady said, okay.
Reluctantly.
Yeah, reluctantly. And she said, and don't park it up around the house. I don't have a lot of room up there. And there was a long driveway that came into her residence.
Yeah, this was a very rural area in Jessamine
rural.
County. It wasn't like in a neighborhood setting.
Yeah.
This was on a
Out in the
rural
country.
2-lane road out in the country. And like Detective Williams said, you turn up a pretty long driveway. When we approached that day, of course, it stuck out like a sore thumb.
When she hears this information, she calls the FBI, because the FBI is, of course, on the story, is the lead investigative agency, and says, I think I've got information on where that car is. She called Agent Gayhart. He immediately called us, and we all took a road trip. And we go to her residence, and as we pull in the driveway, I think it was you and me, Billy, that went down
Paul
first initially.
And it was very, very strange because we clearly we need to go talk to her first. It's her property. But as we got closer to the vehicle, it was very obvious something was wrong. Around this car was dead grass. Around the whole complete circumference of this car was grass that clearly was dead, and it was high grass. And it made sense, and Paul and I knew immediately that, when a body decomps, basically it puts off ammonia and other gases, and it'll kill the grass. So we knew there was a significant amount of something that killed the grass. And of course, when we stepped out of our vehicle,
if you walked downwind of it, it was
we could smell him right away. So
figuring that out.
So we started making calls to other people and involved Jessamine County was already involved to some degree. We kind of given them a courtesy notice, and I think they were going to send a deputy out to help us. So I think then they immediately contacted the coroner.
Was the homeowner aware that there was a person in the vehicle?
No.
Well, that's the strange part to this. I mean, one side of you looks at it and says, well, you live there, you have to smell something. We're talking about a body, and this gentleman was about 5'10" or 5'11", 240, 250 pounds. He's a large man, and he'd been in this trunk arguably, well, we'll say close to a month. We don't know exactly.
He was also packed in lime, though.
Yeah, he was packed in lime, wrapped in a
he was
tarp
in a box
and baling wire.
With a tarp wrapped with baling wire, tape, and then the whole thing had bags of lime poured over it.
So, we knew right off the bat when we stepped out of our cruiser that we had somebody's body. We didn't know it was him.
We pretty well we found it.
So with that, the next step in this was, again, going into evidence mode, making contact with the landowner, and I think a lot more information was gotten from her. But we contacted Frankfurt in regards to the body, and I think the medical examiner there said, hey, let's bring the car with the body to Frankfurt.
Is it safe to say that until you've smelt the difference between a human body decomposing, that it may not be discernible from an animal?
I don't know if I'd say that. Yeah. I'd say most of your folks in the country, between dead deer, dead cows, stuff on the road, have plenty of opportunity to smell dead stuff. And there's no differentiation.
This was such
there's no differentiation between a human body.
But this was such a strong, pungent odor.
But we were about at least 150 yards from the house. It was in a little low area by a creek away from the road. And it would literally depend on if the wind was blowing. I mean,
well, and again, not because I think we skipped ahead a little bit about how did you access the car to discern that there was a body there?
Well, I think at some point somebody accessed the trunk while we were there.
When we walked up to it, the biggie was the smell.
Yeah.
I mean, walking up to it, didn't smell anything. As soon as you got downwind, bam. And we just like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
We got something dead in or under that car. So we had to wait for a search warrant before we could get into it.
Right.
Did you have the keys?
I think the keys were in it, if I remember right. The keys were in
the battery
the
was dead. Somewhere. The VIN number was covered and it had no tags on it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the keys were in it.
There was a
not.
key somewhere in the vehicle, I think, that we found, and that's when they popped the trunk and shut it right back.
Yeah, popped the trunk, and all you saw was just a big bed of lime. You didn't see any body or anything else, but there were little holes coming out of the lime. And out of those holes were maggots climbing out. So we knew, and of course, when they get exposed to light and sun, they go hide. So they were running right back down the holes. So we knew that, and this tells you that he was exposed enough, long enough, in an environment where flies found him and laid eggs on him before he was packaged and put in the trunk.
Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.